नेचुरल रिसोर्सेज का हमें बहुत ज़्यादा ध्यान रखना होता है, क्योंकि अगर सारी चीज़ें ठीक हैं और एनवायरनमेंट को कुछ भी हो गया ना तो हमें मतलब बहुत सारी तकलीफ होगी। तो इसलिए हमें जो अपने एनवायरनमेंट का बहुत ही ज़्यादा ध्यान रखना है, ठीक है। तो इसमें हम क्या पढ़ रहे हैं, द 1992 अर्थ समिट हैज ब्रॉट एनवायरमेंटल इश्यूज टू द सेंटर स्टेज ऑफ ग्लोबल पॉलिटिक्स एंड द पिक्चर्स अबव शो रेन फॉरेस्ट एंड मैनग्रोव्स। इसके बाद जो नेक्स्ट है वो क्या है, दिस चैप्टर एग्जामिन्स द ग्रोइंग सिग्निफिकेंस ऑफ एनवायरमेंटल एज वेल एज रिसोर्स इश्यूज इन वर्ल्ड पॉलिटिक्स। इट एनालाइजेज in a comparative perspective some of the important environmental movements against the backdrop of the rising profile of environmentalism from the 1960s onwards. Notions of common property resources and the global commons too are assessed. We also discuss in the brief the stand taken by India in more recent environmental debates. Next follows a brief account of the geopolitics of resource competition. We conclude by taking note of the indigenous peoples' voices and concerns from the margins of contemporary world politics. उसके बाद इधर जो है ये क्या है, पॉलिटिक्स इन द फॉरेस्ट्स, पॉलिटिक्स इन द वाटर्स, पॉलिटिक्स इन द एटमोसफेयर, व्हाट इज़ नॉट पॉलिटिकल देन। ये सोचने वाली बात है ना, हर चीज़ तो जो है पॉलिटिकली ही मतलब डिस्कस की जाती है। Around the Aral Sea, thousands of people have had to leave their homes on the toxic waters have totally destroyed the fishing industry and the shipping industry, and all related activities have collapsed. Rising concentration of salt in the soil have caused low crop yields. Numerous studies have been conducted. In fact, local jokes that if everyone who had come to study the Aral had brought a bucket of water, the sea would be full by now. इधर जो है ये क्या है, एनवायरमेंटल कंसर्न्स इन द ग्लोबल पॉलिटिक्स। इन दिस बुक वी हैव डिस्कस्ड वर्ल्ड पॉलिटिक्स इन अ फेयरली लिमिटेड सेंस, वॉर्स एंड ट्रीटीज, राइज एंड डिक्लाइन ऑफ स्टेट पावर एंड द रिलेशनशिप बिटवीन द गवर्नमेंट्स दैट रिप्रेजेंट देयर कंट्रीज इन द इंटरनेशनल अरेना एंड द रोल ऑफ इंटर गवर्नमेंटल ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस। इन चैप्टर 5 we expanded the scope of world politics to include issues like poverty and epidemics that may not have been a very difficult step to take, for we all think that governments are responsible for controlling these. In that sense, they fall within the scope of world politics. Now consider some other issues. Do you think they fall within the scope of contemporary world politics? Throughout the world, cultivable area is barely expanding anymore, and a substantial portion of existing agricultural land is losing fertility. Grasslands have been overgrazed and fisheries overharvested. Water bodies have suffered extensive depletion and pollution, severely restricting food production. According to the Human Development Report 2016 of the United Nations Development Programme, 663 million people in developing countries have no access to safe water, and 2.4 billion have no access to sanitation, resulting in the death of more than 3 million children every year. Natural forests, which help stabilize the climate, moderate water supplies, and harbor a majority of the planet's biodiversity on the lands, are being cut down, and people are being displaced, and the loss of biodiversity continues due to the destruction of habitat in areas which are rich in species. A steady decline in the total amount of ozone in the Earth's stratosphere, commonly referred to as the ozone hole, poses a real danger to ecosystems and human health. Coastal pollution too is increasing globally, although the open sea is relatively clean and the coastal waters are becoming increasingly polluted, largely due to the land-based activities. If unchecked, intensive human settlement of coastal zones across the globe will lead to further deterioration in the quality of the marine environment. ये क्या है यहाँ पे, वाई डू यू थिंक द फिंगर्स आर डिजाइंड लाइक चिमनीज एंड द वर्ल्ड मेड इन टू अ लाइटर। ठीक है, तो ये पिक्चर हो गया। यू माइट सीक आस्क, वी आर नॉट टॉकिंग हियर अबाउट द नेचुरल फिनोमिना दैट शुड बी स्टडीड इन द ज्योग्राफी रादर देन इन द पॉलिटिकल साइंस, बट थिंक अबाउट इट अगेन। इफ द वेरियस गवर्नमेंट्स टेक स्टेप्स टू चेक environmental degradation of the kind mentioned above, these issues will have political consequences in that sense. Most of them are such that no single government can address them fully. Therefore, they have to become part of world politics. Issues of environment and natural resources are political in another deeper sense. Who causes environmental degradation? Who pays the price, and who is responsible for taking corrective action? Who gets to use how much of the natural resources of the earth? All these raise the issue of who wields how much power, and they are therefore deeply political questions. Although environmental concerns have a long history, awareness of the environmental consequences of economic growth acquired an increasingly political character from the 1960s onwards. The Club of Rome, a global think tank, published a book in 1972 entitled Limits to Growth, dramatizing the potential depletion of the Earth's resources against the backdrop of rapidly growing world population. International agencies, including the United Nations Environment Programme (UNEP), began holding international conferences and promoting detailed studies to get a more coordinated and effective response to the environmental problems. Since then, the environment has emerged as a significant issue of global politics. The growing focus on the environmental issues within the arena of global politics was formally consolidated at the United Nations Conference on the Environment and Development held in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil in June 1992. This was also called the Earth Summit, and the summit was attended by 170 states, thousands of NGOs, and many multinational corporations. 5 years earlier, the 1987 Brundtland report, Our Common Future, had warned that traditional patterns of economic growth were not sustainable in the long term, especially in view of the demands of the South for the further industrial development. What was obvious at the Rio summit was that the rich and developed countries of the First World, generally referred to as the Global North, were pursuing a different environmental agenda than the poor and developing countries of the Third World, called the Global South, whereas the northern states were concerned with the ozone depletion and global warming, and the southern states were anxious to address the relationship between the economic development and environmental management. The Rio Summit produced conventions dealing with the climate change, biodiversity, forestry, and recommended a list of developed practices called Agenda 21. But it left unresolved considerable differences and difficulties. There was a consensus on combining economic growth with ecological responsibility. This approach to development is commonly known as sustainable development. And the problem, however, was how exactly this was to be achieved. Some critics have pointed out that Agenda 21 was biased in favor of economic growth rather than ensuring ecological conservation. Let us look at some of the contentious issues in the global politics of environment. The protection of global commons. Commons are those resources which are not owned by anyone but rather shared by a community, and this could be a common room, a community center, a park, or a river. Similarly, there are some areas or regions of the world which are located outside the sovereign jurisdiction of any one state and therefore require common governance by the international community. And these are known as res communis, humanities, or global commons, and they include the Earth's atmosphere, Antarctica, and the ocean floor and the outer space. ये क्या है? अंटार्कटिका है. ये क्या था? रेज योर हैंड इफ यू वांट टू सेव द प्लेनेट. ठीक है. आर देयर डिफरेंट परस्पेक्टिव्स फ्रॉम विच द रिच एंड द पुअर कंट्रीज एग्री टू प्रोटेक्ट द अर्थ. उसके बाद जो नेक्स्ट है, यहाँ पे अंटार्कटिका का केस दे रखा है. सो द अंटार्कटिका कॉन्टिनेंटल रीजन एक्सटेंड्स ओवर 14 million square kilometers and comprises 26% of the world's wilderness area, representing 90% of all terrestrial ice and 70% of planetary fresh water. And the Antarctic also extends to a further 36 million square kilometer of ocean. It has limited terrestrial life and a highly productive marine ecosystem comprising a few plants, example microscopic algae, fungi, and lichen, marine mammals, fish, and hordes of birds adapted to harsh conditions, as well as the krill, which is central to marine food chain and upon which other animals are dependent. And the Antarctic plays an important role in maintaining climatic equilibrium, and deep ice cores provide an important source of information about greenhouse gas concentrations and atmospheric temperatures of hundreds and thousands of years ago. Who owns the coldest, farthest, and windiest continent on the globe? There are two claims about it. Some countries like the UK, Argentina, Chile, Norway, France, Australia, and New Zealand have made legal claims to sovereign rights over Antarctic territory. Most other states have taken the opposite view, that the Antarctic is a part of the global commons and not subject to the exclusive jurisdiction of any state. And these differences, however, have not prevented the adoption of innovation and potentially far-reaching rules for the protection of the Antarctic environment and its ecosystem. And the Antarctic and the Arctic polar regions are subjected to special rules of environmental protection. Since 1959, activities in the area have been limited to scientific research, fishing, and tourism. Even these limited activities have not prevented parts of the region from being degraded by the waste as a result of oil spills. So we were discussing about the cooperation over the global commons is not easy. There have been many paths-breaking agreements, such as the 1959 Antarctic Treaty, the 1987 Montreal Protocol, and the 1991 Antarctic Environmental Protocol. A major problem underlying all ecological issues related to the difficulty of achieving consensus on the common environmental agendas on the very soon we will have ecological degradation of the moon. Now, a major problem underlying all ecological issues related to the difficulty of achieving consensus on the common environmental agendas on the agendas on the basis of vague scientific evidence and time frames. In that sense, the discovery of ozone hole over the Antarctic in the mid 1980s revealed the opportunity as well as dangers inherent in tackling global environmental problems. Here, what is shown here, one of the biggest catastrophes in Africa in the 1970s, a drought turned the best cropland in the 5 countries into cracked and barren earth. In fact, the term environmental refugees come into popular vocabulary. After this, many had to flee their homelands as agriculture was no longer possible. इधर क्या है ये? Similarly, the history of outer space as a global commons shows that management of these areas is thoroughly influenced by the north-south inequalities. As with the Earth's atmosphere and the ocean floor, the crucial issues here is technology and industrial development. And this is important because the benefits of exploitative activities in outer space are far from the being equal either for the present or the future generations. ये क्या है? Find out more about the Kyoto Protocol, which major countries did not sign it and why. ठीक है, ये बताना है. उसके बाद जो next ये क्या है? Common but differentiated responses. We have noted about a difference in the approach or to the environment between the countries of the north and the south. The developed countries of the north want to discuss the environment issues as it stands now and want everyone to be equally responsible for the ecological conservation. And the developing countries of the south feel that much of the ecological degradation in the world is the product of industrial development undertaken by the developed countries. If they have caused more degradation, they must also take more responsibility for undoing the damage now. Moreover, the developing countries are in the process of industrialization and they must not be subjected to the same restrictions which apply to the developed countries. Thus, the special needs of the developing countries must be taken into account in the development application and interpretation of the rules of the international environmental law. And this argument was accepted in the Rio Declaration at the Earth Summit in 1992 and is called as the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. And the relevant part of the Rio Declaration says that the states shall cooperate in the spirit of global partnership to conserve, protect and restore the health and integrity of the Earth's ecosystem. Yes, I am reading. The relevant part of the Rio Declaration says that the states shall cooperate in the spirit of global partnership to conserve, protect, and restore the health and integrity of the Earth's ecosystem. In view of the different contribution of global environmental degradation, states have common but differentiated responsibilities, and the developed countries acknowledge the responsibility that they bear in the international pursuit of sustainable development in view of the pressures their societies place on the global environment and of the technological and financial resources they command. The 1992 United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change (UNFCCC) also provides that the parties should act to protect the climate system on the basis of equity and in accordance with their common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. The parties to the convention agreed that the largest share of historical and current global emissions of greenhouse gases has originated in developed countries. It was also acknowledged that per capita emissions in developing countries are still relatively low. China, India, and other developing countries were therefore exempted from the requirements of the Kyoto Protocol. And the Kyoto Protocol is an international agreement setting targets for the industrialized countries to cut their greenhouse gas emissions. Certain gases like carbon dioxide, methane, hydrofluorocarbons, etc., are considered at least partly responsible for the global warming and the rise in the global temperature, which may have catastrophic consequences for life on the Earth. The protocol was agreed to in 1997 in Kyoto in Japan based on the principles set out in the UNFCCC. उसके बाद जो नेक्स्ट है ये क्या है? ये है दैट्स अ कूल प्रिंसिपल, अ बिट लाइक द रिजर्वेशन पॉलिसी इन आवर कंट्री, इजंट इट? उसके बाद जो नेक्स्ट है ये क्या है? आई हर्ड अबाउट सम रिवर्स बीइंग सोल्ड इन लैटिन अमेरिका. How can common property be sold? Common property resources. Common property represents common property for the group, and the underlying norm here is that the members of the group have both rights and duties with respect to the nature, levels of use, and the maintenance of a given resources through the mutual understanding and centuries of practice. Many village communities in India, for example, have defined members' rights and responsibilities. A combination of factors, including privatization, agricultural intensification, population growth, and ecosystem degradation, have caused common property to dwindle in the size, quality, and availability to the poor in much of the world. And the institutional arrangement for the actual management of the sacred groves on the state-owned forest land appropriately fits the description of a common property design. Along the forest belt of the South India, sacred groves have been traditionally managed by the village communities. India's stand on the environmental issues. India signed and ratified the 1997 Kyoto Protocol in August 2002. India, China, and other developing countries were exempt from the requirements of the Kyoto Protocol because their contribution to the emission of greenhouse gases during the industrialization period that is believed to be causing today's global मेरे को बस सेटिस्फेक्शन मिल जाएगी कि यस मैंने ये बुक जो है एक बार रीड कर ली, दैट्स इट। या तो वैसे भी हमारा दिमाग रखता ही नहीं है, 2 दिन बाद तो वो सारी चीज़ें जो है वो डिलीट कर ही देता है दिमाग से, ठीक है। तो जो विद्या होती है, जो पढ़ाई होती है, वो बस वही होती है जो पढ़ने के बाद हमारे कंठ में, दिमाग में किसी टाइम काम आ जाए धरती पे। बाकी तो बस हम पढ़ते हैं और भूल जाते हैं 2 दिन बाद, ठीक है। उसके बाद जब नेक्स्ट डे क्या बात कर रहे थे हम, सेक्रेड ग्रूव्स इन इंडिया। प्रोटेक्टिंग नेचर फॉर द रिलीजियस रीजन्स इज एन एंशिएंट प्रैक्टिस इन मैनी ट्रेडिशनल सोसाइटीज। Sacred groves in India, parcels of uncut forest vegetation in the name of certain deities or natural or ancestral spirits, exemplify such practice as a model of community-based resources management. Groves have lately gained attention in the conservation literature, and the sacred groves can be seen as a system that informally forces ट्रेडिशनल। और मैं भूल भी गई, तो ये रिकॉर्डिंग है किस लिए, सुन लूँगी दोबारा, दोबारा बुक थोड़ी पढ़ूंगी मैं। Traditional communities to harvest natural resources in an ecologically sustained fashion. Some researchers believe that sacred groves hold the potential for the preserving not only biodiversity and ecological functions, but also cultural diversity. Sacred groves embody a rich set of forest preservation practices, and they share characteristics with the common property resource system. Their size ranges from clumps of a few trees to several hundred acres. Traditionally, sacred groves have been valued for their embodied spiritual and cultural attributes. Hindus community worshipped natural objects, including trees and groves. Many temples have originated from the sacred groves. Deep religious reverence for the nature rather than resource scarcity seems to be the basis for the long-standing commitment to preserving these forests. In recent years, however, expansion and human settlement have slowly encroached on the sacred forests. In many places, the institutional identity of these traditional forests is fading with the advent of new national forest policies. A real problem in managing sacred groves arises when legal ownership and operational control are held by different entities. The two entities in the question, the state and the community, vary in their policy norms and underlying motives for using the sacred grove. इधर हम बात करें इंडिया स्टैंड ऑन द इन्वायरमेंटल इश्यूज। India signed and ratified the 1997 Kyoto Protocol in August 2002. India, China, and other developing countries were exempt from the requirement of the Kyoto Protocol because their contribution to the emission of greenhouse gases during the industrialization period that is believed to be causing today's global warming and climate change was not significant. However, critics of the Kyoto Protocol point out that sooner or later, both India and China, along with the other developing countries, will be among the leading contributors to the greenhouse gas emissions. At the G8 meeting in June 2005, India pointed out that the per capita emission rates of the developing countries are a tiny fraction of those in the developing world. Following the principle of commons but differentiated responsibilities, India is of the view that the major responsibility of curbing emissions rests with the developing countries, which have accumulated emissions over a long period of time. India's international negotiating positions relies heavily on the principles of historical responsibility as enshrined in the UNFCCC. This acknowledges that developed countries are responsible for the most historical and current greenhouse gas emissions and emphasizes that economic and social development are the first and overriding priorities of the developing country parties. ये क्या है? I get it first. They destroyed the earth. Now it is our turn to do the same. Is that our stand? ये क्या है? Troubled waters, trapped people. ठीक है, ये हो गया डन। पोल्यूशन, ओवरफिशिंग, डैमेजिंग। हियर इज अ स्नैपशॉट ऑफ द मैनी प्रॉब्लम्स फेस्ड बाय द कम्युनिटीज इन डिफरेंट पार्ट्स ऑफ द इंडिया। ठीक है, अलग अलग जो है मतलब जगहों पे दिया गया है। केरला भी, तमिलनाडु भी, उड़ीसा भी, वेस्ट बंगाल भी, बिहार एंड झारखंड भी, मध्य प्रदेश एंड छत्तीसगढ़ भी, असम भी, उत्तर प्रदेश एंड उत्तरांचल भी, गुजरात भी, आंध्र प्रदेश भी, हर जगह की जो बातें हैं वो अलग अलग बताई गई हैं। ठीक है, फिश लॉज अलग दे रखे हैं, कोस्टल इन्वायरमेंटल इश्यूज अलग दे रखे हैं। ठीक है, मतलब ओवर एक्सप्लॉयटेशन ऑफ फिश एंड मराइन लाइफ, डिग्रेडेशन ऑफ सी बेड एंड फिश पॉपुलेशंस ड्यू टू द dredging or degradation of mangroves due to the surge in the demand of the fish prawns. A considerable fraction of the untreated sewerage water is dumped into the ocean. Terrestrial pollutants car ride in by rivers. Over mechanization, pollution from the industry along the coast and effluent from the aquaculture farms pollutes the surroundings marine environment. इधर फिश लॉज लिखे हुए इंटरनेशनल रेगुलेशन लॉ ऑफ द सी कोस्टल कंट्रीज हैव sovereign rights over a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone EEZ of the coast. They are also bound by it to prevent and control marine pollution. National Regulation Fisheries Act 1897 prohibits the use of poison and dynamite in the use of inshore fishing and regulates net sizes and construction of the wires. Amendments to Indian Wildlife Protection Act 1993 and 2002. Fish are added under the definition of animals. Marine Fishing Policy 2004. Main objectives are to change marine fish to, production to the sustained above level, to increase the export and per capita fish protein intake of the masses, ensure economic security of the traditional fishermen, and to develop environmentally sustainable marine fisheries. ठीक है, इधर जो है नेक्स्ट क्या है, नेक्स्ट जो पैराग्राफ है हमारा वो है So India is wary of recent discussions within UNFCCC about introducing binding commitments on the rapidly industrializing countries such as Brazil, China and India to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. India feels that the contravenes the very spirit of UNFCCC. Neither does it seem fair to impose restrictions on India when the country's rise in per capita carbon emissions by 2030 is likely to still represent less than half the world average of 3.8 tons in 2000. Indian emissions are predicted to rise from 0.9 tons per capita in 2000 to 1.6 tons per capita in 2030. The Indian government is already participating in global efforts through a number of programs. For example, India's National Auto Fuel Policy mandates cleaner fuel for the vehicles. The Energy Conservation Act passed in 2001 outlines initiatives to improve the energy efficiency. Or similarly, the Electricity Act of 2003 encourages the use of renewable energy. Recent trends in importing natural gas and increasing the adoption of clean coal technologies show that India has been making real efforts. The government is also keen to launch a national mission on the biodiesel, using about 11 million hectares of land to produce biodiesel by 2011-12. India ratified the Paris Climate Agreement on 2 October 2016, and India has one of the largest renewable energy programs in the world. A review of the implementation of the agreements at the Earth Summit in the Rio was undertaken by India in 1997. One of the key conclusions was that there had been no meaningful progress with respect to the transfer of new and additional financial resources and environmentally sound technology on the concessional terms to developing nations. India finds it necessary that developed countries take immediate measures to provide developing countries with the financial resources and clean technologies to enable them to meet their existing commitments under the UNFCCC. India is also of the view that the SAARC countries should adopt a common position on the major global environment issues so that the region's voice carries greater weight. Environmental movements, one or many. We have so far looked at the way governments have reacted at the international level to the challenge of the environmental degradation. But some of the most significant responses to this challenge have come not from the governments but rather from the groups of environmentally conscious volunteers working in the different parts of the world. Some of them work at the international level, but most of them work at the local level. These environmental movements are amongst the most vibrant, diverse and powerful social movements across the globe. Today, it is within the social movement that new forms of political action are born or reinvented. And these movements raise new ideas and long-term visions of what we should do and what we should not do in our individual and collective lives. Here are just a few examples to show that diversity is an important trait of contemporary environmental movements. And the forest movements of the South in the Mexico, Chile, Brazil, Malaysia, Indonesia, continental Africa and India, just to list a few examples, are faced with enormous pressure. Forest clearing in the third world continues at an alarming rate. Despite 3 decades of the environmental activism, the destruction of the world's last remaining grand forests has actually increased in the last decades. And the minerals industry is one of the most powerful forms of the industry on the planet. A large number of economies of the South are now being reopened to MNC through the liberalization of the global economy. And the mineral industry's extraction of the earth, its use of chemicals, its pollution of water, ways and land, its clearance of native vegetation, its displacement of communities, amongst other factors, continue to invite criticism and resistance in various parts of the globe. Now let's see. यहाँ पे क्या है, लेट्स फाइंड आउट अबाउट द चिपको मूवमेंट एंड वन आर फॉरेस्ट विल्डरनेस. So what distinguishes the forest movements of the south from those of the north is that the forests of the farmer are still peopled, whilst the forests of the latter are more or less devoid of human habitat, or at least are perceived as thus. This explains to some extent the prevailing notion of wilderness in the north as a wild place where people do not live. In this perspective, humans are not seen as a part of nature. In other words, environment is perceived as somewhere out there, as something that should be protected from humans through the creation of parks and reserves. On the other hand, most environmental issues in the south are based on the assumption that people live in the forests. Wilderness oriented perspectives have been predominated in Australia, Scandinavia, North America, and New Zealand. In these regions, there are still large tracts of relatively underdeveloped wilderness. Unlike in most European countries, this is not to say that wilderness campaigns are entirely missing in the south. In the Philippines, green organizations fight to protect eagles and other birds of the prey from the extinction. In India, a battle goes on to protect the alarmingly low number of Bengal tigers. In Africa, a long campaign has been waged against the ivory trade and the savage slaughter. माई मदर इज़ गुड, बट उनको विंटर की वजह से जो अभी आई थिंक सर्दी लग गई है, एंड शी इज़ डूइंग वेल. इन अफ्रीका अ लॉन्ग campaign, thank you for asking about her. In Africa, a long campaign has been waged against the ivory trade and the savage slaughter of elephants. Some of the most famous wilderness struggles have been fought in the forests of Brazil and Indonesia. All of these campaigns focus on the individual species as well as the conservation of the wilderness habitats which support them. Many of the wilderness issues have been renamed biodiversity issues in recent times. As the concept of wilderness has been proved difficult to sail in the south, many of these campaigns have been initiated and funded by the NGOs such as the Worldwide Wildlife Fund, WWF, in associated with the local people. उसके बाद हम क्या बात कर रहे थे? One good example is that of the, पहले एक बार ये और देख लेते हैं. An entire community erupted in protests against a proposed open cast coal mine project in the Fulbari town in the northwest district of Dinazpur, Bangladesh. Here, several dozen women, one with her infant child, are chanting slogans against the proposed coal mine project in 2006. ये क्या है यहाँ पे? नो एग्जिट, हाउ न्यू कॉलोनियलिज्म वर्क्स नाउ दैट्स वी हैव डिस्ट्रॉयड योर कंट्री, यू कैन पे अस टू रिबिल्ड इट, वी एक्सेप्ट नेचुरल रिसोर्सेज लाइक ऑयल एज अ पेमेंट. One good example is that of the Philippines, where a vast network of groups and organizations campaigned against the Western Mining Corporation (WMC), an Australia-based multinational company. Much opposition to the company in its own country, Australia, is based on anti-nuclear sentiments and advocacy for the basic rights of Australia. Indigenous peoples, another group of movements, are those involved in struggles against mega dams. In every country where a mega dam is being built, one is likely to find an environmental movement opposing it. Increasingly, anti-dam movements are pro-river movements for more sustainable and equitable management of the river systems and valleys. And the early 1980s saw the first anti-dam movement launched in the north, namely the campaign to save the Franklin River and its surrounding forests in Australia. This was a wilderness and forest campaign as well as anti-dam campaign. At present, there has been a spurt in mega dam building in the south from Turkey to Thailand to South Africa, from Indonesia to China. India has had some of the leading anti-dam pro-river movements. Narmada Bachao Andolan is one of the best known of these movements. It is significant to note that in the anti-dam and other environmental movements in India, the most important shared idea is non-violence. Resource geopolitics. Resource geopolitics is all about who gets what, when, where and how. Resources have provided some of the key means and motives of global European power expansion. They have also been the focus of interstate rivalry. Western geopolitical thinking about resources has been dominated by the relationship of the trade war and power, at the core of which were overseas resources and maritime navigation. Since sea power itself rested on the access to timber, naval timber supply became a key priority for the major European powers from 17th century onwards, and the critical importance of ensuring uninterrupted supply of strategic resources, in particular oil, was well established both during the First World War and the Second World War. Throughout the Cold War, the industrialized countries of the North adopted a number of methods to ensure a steady flow of resources, and these included the deployment of military forests near exploitation sites with and along sea lanes of communication, and the stockpiling of strategic resources. Efforts to prop up friendly governments in producing countries, as well as support to the multinational companies and favorable international agreements. Traditional Western strategic thinking remained concerned with the access to supplies, which might be threatened by the Soviet Union. A particular concern was Western control of oil in the Gulf and strategic minerals in the southern and central Africa. After the end of the Cold War and the disintegration of the Soviet Union, and the security of the supply continues to worry government and business decisions with regard to the several minerals, in particular radioactive materials. However, oil continues to be the most important resource in the global strategy. The global economy relied on oil for much of the 20th century as a portable and indispensable fuel. The immense wealth associated with oil generates political struggles to control it, and the history of petroleum is also the history of war and struggle. Nowhere is this more obviously the case than in the West Asia and the Central Asia. West Asia, specifically the Gulf region, accounts for about 30% of global oil production, but it has about 64% of the planet's known reserves, and is therefore the only region able to satisfy any substantial rise in the oil demand. Saudi Arabia has a quarter of the world's total reserves and is the single largest producer. Iraq's known reserves and are the second only to the Saudi Arabia's, and saying substantial portions of the Iraqi territorial are yet to be fully explored, and there is a fair chance that actual reserves might be far larger. And the United States, Europe, Japan, and increasingly India and China, which consume their petroleum, are located at a considerable distance from the region. Water is another crucial resource that is relevant to the global politics, regional variations, and the increasing scarcity of the fresh water in some parts of the world point to the possibility of disagreements over shared water resources as the leading source of the conflicts in the 21st century. Some commentators on the world politics have referred to the water wars to describe the possibility of violent conflicts over these life-sustaining resources. Countries that share rivers can disagree over the many things. For instance, a typical disagreement is a downstream lower riparian states' objection to the pollution, excessive irrigation or the construction of the dams by an upstream upper riparian state, which might decrease or degrade the quality of water available to the downstream state. States have used force to protect or seize fresh water resources. Examples of violence include those between the Israel, Syria, and Jordan in the 1950s and 1960s, over attempts by each side to divert water from the Jordan and Yarmouk rivers, and more recent threats between Turkey, Syria, and Iraq over the construction of dams on the Euphrates River. A number of studies show that countries that share rivers, and many countries do share rivers, are involved in the military conflicts with each other. How are these conflicts different from the many water conflicts within our own country? ये हो गया डन. उसके बाद जो नेक्स्ट है वो क्या है, ये द लार्जर पार्ट ऑफ द अर्थ इज वाटर देन द लैंड एंड येट द कार्टूनिस्ट्स डिसाइड टू शो लार्जर इमेज ऑफ द लैंड देन द वाटर. हाउ डज द इमेज शो द स्कैरसिटी ऑफ वाटर? इधर जो है ये क्या है, एवरी वन इज प्लेइंग क्रूड. इधर क्या है, ये द लिस्ट ऑफ पेट्रोलियम बेस्ड प्रोडक्ट्स इन आवर लाइव्स इज एंडलेस. टूथब्रश, पेस मेकर, paints, inks, oil provides the energy for 95% of the world's transportation needs, and the whole industrialized world survives on the petroleum, and we cannot imagine living without it, and there are billions of barrels of it under the earth for us to use. Yet there are disputes between countries. Why? Here is one of the problems. This is Sheikh Petrodullah, king of the land of black gold. I belong to the royal family of the kingdom of black gold. I am what they call filthy rich. Ever since black gold was found in my kingdom, things have never Okay, I belong to the royal family of the kingdom of black gold. I am what they call filthy rich. Ever since black gold was found in my kingdom, things have never been the same again. Mr. Big Oil and his government came prospecting one day. We struck oil and a deal. They armed me to the teeth till it hurt. So when I green, my subjects look at me with awe. In return, Big Oil and sons get to buy all my oil and loyalty. I am happy and rich, and so are they. I turn my blind eye. I turn my blind eye to the military in this holy land. I value precious things. Big Oil says his president values freedom and democracy, so I keep both safely under lock and key in my land. ये क्या है? मिस्टर बिग ऑयल, CEO of Big Oil and Sons. As advised, I did ask myself, what can I do for my country? My country has an enormous appetite for the oil, so provide it with oil, of course. I believe in the free market system, free to dig up oil in faraway countries, free to create pliable teen port dictators to keep the local population at bay, and free to destroy ecology. We play no policies but pay them at election campaigns and get them to invest in our company. That way, we don't have to embarrass ourselves by foolishly waving and smiling at TV cameras. इधर जो है next क्या है? Leading the good life. A new beauty is parked outside our garage. Awesome, isn't it? Sleek chrome finish, power steering, automatic gears, excellent pickup and great mileage too. It is low on emissions too, gentle on the atmosphere, global warming and all that stuff. Now we really are in hurry to zoom off and lead the good life. God save everyone. ठीक है, ये है मिस्टर एंड मिसेस गोबलेडो. इधर जो नेक्स्ट है ये है एरोरिस्ट्स लूज कैनन बॉल्स. Toppleton defends freedom and democracy. That's why he is so generous with guns and missiles. Like the ones he gave us to fight the invading ruffians, he even trained us. We did not realize that it was the oil they were after. Big Oil is always trying to woo us. But we are too busy playing war games. Now we have rules of our own. Toppleton's government kept changing its rules. Not fair, we said. Some of us now hate Toppleton and his government and his people. Of course, their bullets and missiles come in handy when we have to beat them at their game. Make no mistake, we are terrorists. उसके बाद जो next है वो क्या है? The indigenous peoples and their rights. The question of indigenous people brings the issues of environment, resources, and politics together. The UN defines indigenous populations as comprising the descendants of peoples who inhabited the present territory of a country at the time when persons of a different culture or ethnic origin arrived there from the other parts of the world and overcame them. Indigenous people today live more in conformity with their particular social, economic, and cultural customs and traditions than the institutions of the country which they now form a part. In the context of world politics, what are the common interests of approximately 30 crore indigenous people spread throughout the world, including India? There are 20 lakh indigenous peoples of the Cordillera region of the Philippines, 10 lakh Mapuche people of Chile, 6 lakh tribal people of the Chittagong Hill tracts in the Bangladesh, 35 lakh North American natives, 50,000 Kuna living east of the Panama Canal, and 10 lakh small peoples of the Soviet North. Like other social movements, indigenous people speak of their struggles, their agenda, and their rights. इधर जो है क्या है? Why don't we hear much about the indigenous peoples and their movements? Is the media biased against them? The indigenous voices in the world politics call for the admission of indigenous peoples to the world community as equals. Indigenous peoples occupy areas in Central and South America, India, where they are known as tribals, and Southeast Asia, many of the present day island states in the Oceania region, including the Australia and New Zealand, were inhabited by the Polynesian, Melanesian, and Micronesian people over the course of thousands of years. They appeal to governments to come to the terms with the continuing existence of indigenous nations as enduring communities with an identity of their own. Since times immemorial is the phrase used by indigenous people all over the world to refer to their continued occupancy of the lands from which they originate, and the worldwide of the indigenous societies irrespective of their geographical location are strikingly similar with respect to the land and the variety of life systems supported by it. And the loss of land, which also means the loss of an economic resources base, is the most obvious threat. ये क्या है? स्पून फुल ऑफ इकोलॉजी. डू यू एग्री विद द पर्सपेक्टिव वेयर अ मैन फ्रॉम एन अर्बन डेवलप्ड एरिया बिकम्स ग्रीडी फॉर द नेचर? इधर जो है हम बात कर रहे थे, they appeal to the governments to come to terms with the continuing existence of indigenous nations. Why did you block her? They appeal to the governments to come to terms with the continuing existence of indigenous nations and enduring communities with an identity of their own. Since times immemorial is the phrase used by the indigenous people all over the world to refer to their continued occupancy of the lands from which they originate. And the world views of indigenous societies, irrespective of their geographical location, are strikingly similar with respect to the land and the variety of life systems supported by it. And the loss of land, which also means the loss of an economic resources base, is the most obvious threat to the survival of the indigenous people. Can political autonomy be enjoyed without its attachment to the means of physical survival? In India, the description indigenous people is usually applied to the scheduled tribes who constitute nearly 8% of the population of the country, with the exception of the small communities of hunters and gatherers. Most indigenous populations in India depend for their subsistence primarily on the cultivation of land for centuries, if not millennia. On phone, she is not coming to eat you, so you can pick up her call. For centuries, if not millennia, they had free access to as much land as they could cultivate. It was only after the establishment of the British colonial rule that areas which had previously been inhabited by the scheduled tribe communities were subjected to outside forces, although they enjoy constitutional protection in political representation. They have not got much of the benefits of development in the country. In fact, they have paid a huge cost for the development, since they are the single largest group among the people displaced by the various developmental projects since independence. Issues related to the rights of the indigenous communities have been neglected in domestic and international politics for very long. During the 1970s, growing international contacts among the indigenous leaders from around the world aroused a sense of common concern and shared experiences. And the World Council of Indigenous Peoples was formed in 1975. The council became subsequently the first of 11 indigenous NGOs to receive consultative status in the UN. Many of the movements against globalization discussed in the chapter 7 have focused on the rights of the indigenous people. Now here is a given activity. Each student is asked to list any 10 items they consume or use every day. The list could include pen, paper, eraser, computer, water, etc. Ask students to calculate the amount of natural resources being used to make these items. For finished products like pen, pencil, computer, etc., students will calculate the amount of resources. And for items like water, they could calculate the amount of electricity used for purifying and pumping along with the gallons of water. Each would calculate and arrive at an approximate figure. उसके बाद नेक्स्ट जो है वो क्या है? Ideas for the teacher. Collect the approximate figure from each student and sum up all to arrive at total resources consumed by the students of that particular class. Teacher is to act as a facilitator and allow students to do the calculations. Project this figure to other classes of the same school and then to the schools across the country. The country figure could be used to measure the amount of resources being used by the schools in other countries too. And the teacher is to have background information about the resources being used by the students in a few select countries. While selecting countries, teachers should ensure that the selected countries belong to the developed or developing countries category. Ask students to imagine the amount of resources we are consuming and also to estimate future consumption. ठीक है, इधर ये चैप्टर खत्म हो गया. अब हम नेक्स्ट चैप्टर डिस्कस करेंगे in the next video. The next chapter would be related to the globalization. Thank you so much for watching it. Stay connected.